Nope. That's what I want. Okay. Do you have this pulled up on your screens yet? The green and yellow slides? Okay. So as we go through this, this kind of presentation, these notes, this is kind of the historical side of it. Remember, our big question for this class is why of the where. Why are things happening where they are in the world? We've kind of been talking about that as we've gone through our units, and especially during this ag unit, we're thinking about why are things grown where they are in the world. So why are certain things grown where they are, and how has it spread? Where is it spread throughout the world? Okay. A side note on this, College Board loves to see that you can make cross connections between units, especially on FRQs. They'll talk about multiple units because they'll want you to be able to connect those ideas. And so with this unit, and especially this presentation, I'm going to be talking about a lot of other units that we've already talked about, because it all kind of comes together and bridges like really nicely with this presentation. Everything kind of starts coming full circle with the stuff that we're going to talk about today. Okay, so I'll point out a bunch of stuff today as we're going, and as we move towards the exam, we get closer to the exam, start thinking about how things we've talked about this year are connected, because it all kind of is connected. And I'll show you how as we get going today. Okay, so we're going to start with some picture analysis skill stuff. This is a skill you need to have, especially for world history. If you're in GT, you might already have a little bit of practice with this. If you see a picture on the exam, you need to be able to know how to kind of dissect it and pick it apart and see what it is telling us. So with this first picture, I want us to kind of brainstorm out loud, talk about what we see, what we notice in this first picture. What do you see? Oh, okay, yeah, there's some sort of animal. I'm not sure what kind of animal, maybe a cow. I don't know. It has kind of some weird horns. I'm not really sure, but yeah, there's an animal. What else? Natalie? Oh. Oh, okay, the actual picture itself, yes, looks like it's not on, I don't know, yeah, some sort of fabric or something. It's definitely not present. It's not a paper, right, yeah, it's not present day, yes, okay. Someone said something else back there. What? Ava, what'd you say? There's a dude? Yeah, there's a guy, right? What do we notice about the guy? Mm-hmm. He's wearing what? Yeah, come on, tell me. Deborah Short, what?
I guess it was like a poncho.
A what?
A poncho?
Yeah. Okay, some sort of, okay, yes, Ava, help us out.
Oh, I was just going to say, it looks like he's wearing cloth. It reminds me
A cloth,
of,
yeah.
Egyptian, painting things.
Okay, yeah.
It's, probably, really early.
So, yes, really early in history. It's really old compared to today. We see this dude wearing, like, a cloth, right? Kind of looks like a skirt. We're not wearing skirts anymore, right? I would assume he probably doesn't have shoes on, maybe. He doesn't have a shirt on. We don't know what he's holding, but maybe that's something to, like, hit the animal, prod the animal, right, to make it go. What about technology? We've determined that this is old. Is there technology in this picture? Ooh, yes, no, I'm hearing different things. Okay, I'm hearing some things. Maybe that is a plow or something. So we know this is old. So the technology is not the Chromebooks that you're looking at right now or the phones that are sitting on your desk, right? That's a form of technology. But also in this picture, there is technology here, right? There is whatever this like plow thing is their form of technology a long time ago, right? Like it is being used agriculturally. We can assume this is for agriculture, right? It's some sort of plow or a seed thing, something to help them with their farm labor, right? We have this relationship between the man and the animal, but it's helping them do the work, right? Okay, so we kind of have talked through what this is, it's very basic what we're getting at, right? It's really old. It's very basic form of technology and farming at this point, right? So that leads us into what we're going to talk about, which is the first agricultural revolution. Okay, this is also known as the Neolithic Revolution. So they can be used as the same thing, okay? Neolithic Revolution equals the first ag revolution. This is where we have our first farms in the world. If you can read that, it's our first farms. Basically, this is the domestication of plants and animals. What does domestication mean? Anyone know? Yeah, it's like raising it as your own, right? So we learned how to grow our crops, and we learned how to raise our animals. So for the first time in history, this is where we stopped being nomadic and moving around and being hunter-gatherers, right? Before this time period, we were hunting down our animals, so we were going wherever the animals were going, and we were also just finding whatever food we could, whatever was growing on the trees or growing on the plants nearby. That's how people were being fed, and that was their food source. So for the first time in history, with the Neolithic Revolution, we learned how to plant some things, plant some seeds to grow some crops, and we learned how to fence in animals so we didn't have to chase them around all the time. Okay, that's what domestication is. So we moved from this hunter-gatherer lifestyle to being more permanent settlements. Okay, and all of that had to do with what? What is a hearth? Again, that's a vocab term we've talked about. Yeah, where it came from, or it's the start of something, the starting place, right? We talked about that in the culture unit. Remember, cultural hearths, where something starts. Same thing with crops. Where did crops start? Where did they originate? Where did they come from? And you have a list of places right there. This is our tie back to the population unit, okay? Because back a long time ago, September, October, whenever we were in our population unit, we looked at where population clusters are. Where are the most densely populated places in the world? And a lot of those are hand in hand where the crop hearths are, okay? Because it's where people first started out. It's where people have stayed. We looked at population hearths in East Asia along the Yellow River. In China, we looked at the population cluster in India, Ganges River, in Pakistan, the Indus River. So all of those places started out because of those water sources that were there. It also says, Southwest Asia. What is Southwest Asia known as? Yeah, say it. Yeah, the Middle East. The Middle East has the Tigris and the Euphrates River. You might have heard of it called like the Fertile Crescent before. Maybe you've heard that in your history class. You'll definitely hear about it next year in world history. But the Middle East is known as Southwest Asia, okay? You're probably not going to see a question on the AP exam that says Middle East because that's kind of like an informal term. The formal term for the region is Southwest Asia, okay? So please burn it in your brain like Southwest Asia equals the Middle East. So when you read that, that's where it's referring to is the Middle East, okay? So again, those rivers there are Tigris and the Euphrates River. Sub-Saharan Africa, rainforest, there's rivers there where people started out and still have stayed. And then in Latin America, think like the Inca and the Mayan civilizations, again, all based on the water sources because that's where they were able to get water to grow their crops, right? We saw it last week in Food Machine in the documentary how important water and irrigation is for growing crops, right? So to make this change from being nomadic herders to being a permanent settlement where we are going to stay somewhere, we have to have access to water, right? And still today, our largest populations are near areas that have access to water, okay? So big tie there with our population unit, okay? Animals, a lot of animals originated out of Southwest Asia, which is the Middle East, okay? So animals and crops, that is where they started. When they made this switch from nomadic herding or nomadic lifestyle to a permanent place. These farming techniques were very small. Okay, so think very small scale, not what we have today, but we just figured out how to grow things and raise our animals for my family, for my community, for my village, and then it eventually turned into these larger civilizations later on. Okay, so at the very beginning, Neolithic Revolution is very small scale type of farming. Okay, are we following? Is it making sense? Okay. All right, let's look at the next picture. Yeah. What do we see? What do we notice about this picture? Yeah, more clothes on this guy, right? So what can we assume?
It's later.
Yeah, it's later. It's more current or more closer to our time period, right? Because of the clothes that he's wearing. Grace? Okay, maybe he's planting something, right? At the bottom of the picture here. Maybe those are seeds going into the ground. What else?
I noticed that his boots look like they're leather, so maybe they've started using that might be like a pallet he's has in his farm.
Okay, yeah, so all of kind of the materials, someone yesterday also pointed out that this this thing is also has different types of materials in it, right? It's uses different things, so maybe we have access now to different types of materials to be able to make things, right? Shoes or this contraption, right? What else?
It's a little bit more advanced.
Yeah, why do you say that?
Well, by looking at it, I'm just guessing.
Okay, by looking at it, we think it's more advanced, Ava.
In the last picture, it looked like it was like they needed the animal
Yeah.
to move it, but in this one they adapted.
Yeah, so we don't have animal, and what did you just say?
They adapted it.
Yeah, what did you Wheels. Wheels are huge here. Yeah, what else?
I was gonna say the wheel and axle.
Yeah. Yes, huge invention, right, was the wheel. So that makes things go maybe a little bit faster, right? This looks more advanced, right? So there's a machine here, right? That's what we're getting at. This is some sort of machine, whereas in the previous picture, we didn't really have that, right? Ava, you talked about how there was an animal before. Now there's no animal. We're not relying on an animal to do the work. So in the first picture, if you had a stubborn cow, a stubborn ox, a stubborn horse that just didn't want to work, didn't want to move, then you were kind of screwed, right? How are you going to plant your crops, right? Here, you've taken out kind of that middleman of the animal, relying on the animal. And now we're relying on this machine, right? What do you think this does for the farm? How is our farm going to change compared from the first picture to this picture now? Ooh, bigger. Why?
Because it takes less time.
Yep, because it takes less time, and also that wheel helps us go farther, right? And go faster. Yeah, you're all on the right track here. So let's talk about this second picture. This is the second agricultural revolution. Big thing here with this one is that it is happening at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. Okay? Industrial Revolution happened what time period again? You need to know this? Yeah, okay, early 1800s. You're second guessing yourself, but you're on the right track. 17 to 1800s. Okay, especially when you see 1800s in a question, you need to think Industrial Revolution. It started out in the 1700s, right, in Great Britain, and then eventually started spreading outward and elsewhere. And so by 1800s, we're in full-blown Industrial Revolution for our more developed countries at that time period. Okay, so for sure, when you see 1800s on the exam on May 4th, you need to think Industrial Revolution. Okay, so let's go back to our very first unit. When we talked about the Industrial Revolution, here's our connection now to that very first unit. What do we know happened during the Industrial Revolution? What have we talked about in this class before with the IR? What did it do? What'd you say? Yeah, products, right? And industry, right? Where was all that happening? What types of jobs? Thank you, factories and factories. Yeah, okay, in urban areas and in factories, right? And so what was helping us with our production? Technology and machinery, yes, both are right. Remember how we talked about all these things, this push in machinery, we had this push in factory types of jobs, and our productivity, our production went way up, right? So we had different types of jobs for the first time, and we were making way more stuff, okay? So that's what we talked about in the first semester during the very first unit. So now let's talk about what the effect of on that in the agricultural world, on the farm, like in the farm life, okay? So industrial revolution is happening. They're making all of these new technologies and all of these new things and inventions and things. And people were like, okay, if we're making inventions for factories, what are most of our people doing right now anyways? We're working on farms. So are there inventions that we can make to improve our farm life? Yes, that's exactly what they did, was they started making all of these new things to help out our productivity on the farm. There's this whole chart in chapter 12 that you'll read this week that talks about all of these inventions that were created during this time period to specifically help out with farm stuff, with agriculture. Things like the plow and barbed wire, I think is really fascinating, came from this time too. So all of these new inventions helped us on the farm life in those agricultural types of jobs. So we just talked about what, Ava, you said that our farms were going to get bigger, right, because of this machine, because machines go faster than people, right? So what starts happening to the types of jobs that we see on farms? There's not as many workers on farms now, right? Because if a machine can do it faster and do it better and do more of it, they can plant faster, if it can harvest faster with a machine, then there's not a need to have a person working on that farm anymore, right? So people start losing their jobs to the machines, and where do they go? To the factories. Urbanization starts to happen, right? So people start leaving the farms and moving to the cities because that's where the jobs are. Remember talking about this in our first unit, this big urbanization push? So from the farm life, people start leaving the rural areas. I think it was the second unit on a skills day. Do you remember looking at that really big chart of all those really tiny numbers, and you guys really didn't like doing that, right? One of those statistics that we looked at was percent urban. What was percent urban? Yeah, Devshore.
How much of the population of the country, how much of the country's population lived in urban areas?
Live in urban areas, yeah. So in your text this week, it tells you for the first time in history, we start to see a larger percentage of our people living in urban areas than we do in rural areas. And it's never changed since that time period, in the U.S. especially. Remember, that is an indicator of a more developed country. When more of your people start living in urban areas than rural areas, then that means you're industrializing. You probably have better stuff because more people are living in urban areas and not in rural areas relying on agricultural jobs, which we know doesn't bring in quite a whole lot of money, right? So tying in a bunch of different factors here from our previous units, all to say that machines were going faster than people, right? So it changed what was happening on the farms, and people started leaving, going to urban areas. This also changed our production of food. Food was cheaper, and we were producing more of it at a faster pace, okay? So again, back to Unit 2, at what time period did our population, world population, start taking off? Do you remember the J curve that we looked at with population growth? When did it start taking off? Not 1900s. 1800s. Yeah, it was the 1800s because we talked about the correlation between the Industrial Revolution and population growth, okay? So at the same time, this is all happening at the same time. Our food is getting cheaper, our population is growing, we're able to feed all of these people now because we have a cheaper source of food, and now we're not as worried about feeding our family, so people start to live longer, which is also adding to our population growth because now people are living longer, we have a stable food supply, and food is being produced cheaper, okay? So people are having less worries now on top of the industrialization that also came with it too, okay? So we see how this is literally all blending and meshing together between industrialization, population growth, and agriculture, okay? It's all literally coming together right now. So the big idea here is that machines make everything go easier. It makes it go faster, right? And it changes what our farms are like, okay? All right, last picture that we have. Lots of things with this one. Let's start talking about what we see here. It's what? There's a lot of crops, right? So this is a real big farm, right? As far as you can go, you can see that there's like these plots of land, right? For as far as you can go, you can see the crops. What else?
It's only guys.
Oh, interesting take. Yes, it's only men. We don't see any women. That's a whole section in itself during this unit. What else? What are they doing? Okay, they're talking. Why is there such a big group of them? What does it look like they're doing? Someone is holding something. This dude is holding that, right? Why? It looks like a crop, yes. Why on earth would they be examining this crop? Ooh, bugs. Someone said that too in a different class. Maybe they're looking at like pests and stuff. Remember from Food Machine last week that Ted Sheely was looking at and talking about all of the bugs that were hurting his crops. Yeah, maybe that could be what we're looking at here.
It might also be like genetically modified.
Ah.
It might be like surveying what it looks like.
Okay, yeah, why would you say that?
Well, I'm assuming because we went through the first and the second, and I know the third agricultural revolution like had GMOs.
Yes, yeah, you're right on the right track. So this dude is showing these other guys the GMOs that he created, okay? This is labeled right here at the bottom, Sonora 64. It's in Mexico. This is like their test kind of crop, right? Think about what you learn in science. You have your control, you have your variables, you have those things, right, that you change. Science. You know what I'm talking about, right? To make sure that your experiment is working and whatnot, right? Like that's literally what they're doing here in Mexico. So, third ag revolution is what this picture is showing. It's also known as the green revolution. So you need to know that green revolution is also the third agricultural revolution, okay? This dude holding the crop is Norman Borlaug. He is the guy who created GMOs, okay? So this time period, since we've talked about it with our other ones, this is like mid-1900s. Nobody mentioned that this is an actual picture, right? It's an actual photograph compared to the first two that were just like paintings of stuff, right? This is a real picture. So this is a picture from mid-1900s, 1950s-ish, and that is Borlaug, who is teaching these Mexican farmers. This is in Mexico. He's showing them and teaching them how this works so that he can move on and teach other people how to do this, okay? So GMOs, genetically modified. He created a wheat plant and then later did it with rice. And the big idea here was that these plants were disease and drought resistant, okay? So during this time period, mid-1900s, our rich countries of the world, our MDCs of the world, we are spending money on the science, behind agriculture, okay? Science and ag. This could be fertilizers, it could be GMOs, all of the sciencey things that needed to improve agriculture. That's what was going on in MDC countries. So we see for the first time really this big push in like American universities and agricultural programs and majors and things like that in colleges across the country. There's all of this push and all of this money that is going towards the science and the research to improve our agriculture. Okay, so that's what's happening in rich countries. So that is how Borlaug is able to come up with and figure out how to make this plant withstand drought and disease, okay? Because in the LDCs of the world, he starts in Mexico, he later goes on to India, and then eventually China as well. But in these poorer countries, those were the places that were at that point really taking off with their population as well. You know how the US does, or not the US, just MDCs in general, like we do things first, right? And then a little while later, then the LDCs come along and like join on board. So that's what's happening in the LDCs. Their population is really starting to take off, and they're having a really hard time feeding their population, okay? They're having a hard time figuring out crops to feed everyone, and they're struggling with overpopulation and feeding their people. And so in Mexico, they were having a hard time. It was a hotter, warmer climate. They couldn't plant things until this wheat plant came along. They figured out how to grow it. It could withstand the disease or the drought, but also the disease from all of those pests. Again, think about Food Machine last week, and he was talking about all those bugs ruining your crops. So these LDC countries are now able to plant crops and a bunch of them to be able to feed all of their people, their growing population, okay? Things like wheat and rice. Why would he have chosen wheat and rice to grow and not like, I don't know, apples and oranges? Okay, it's the main diet. What else?
It's used in other products.
Yeah, it can be. Growing conditions, yes, it can grow better there. Also, it's high calorie, right? So it's really filling. So you don't need as much rice, or a smaller amount of rice will go a long way, right? Compared to a fruit or something else, right? So these high caloric foods were able to be made fairly cheaply, and you could make a lot of it and it would go a lot farther. Like it would feed a lot more mouths, basically, right? And it was filling. So people didn't maybe need as much, and they would still get what they needed to not starve, right? And that's what these countries were facing, with starvation, okay? So MDCs were the ones figuring out this science and the technology and everything behind it. The LDCs of the world at this time, this is when they are starting to get their mechanization. Whereas we got it in our second ag revolution, the third ag revolution, like mid-1900s, is when this mechanization finally starts to reach the LDCs of the world, okay? So all of this together seems like good things. However, there were some bad things that came from this too. And side note on this, College Board also likes to make you think about both sides of a topic, okay? In FRQs, one part might say, okay, what are the positive consequences of blah, blah, blah? And then in the next part, what are the negative consequences of blah, blah, blah? Okay, they like to make you think about both sides, and this would be a good example of how they could do that. So we've just been talking about how Green Revolution was good in making things better, but there were also some bad things too that happened because of the Green Revolution, okay? Things like pollution. Pollution happened now because of the machines that were being introduced to the LDC countries, those emissions from the tractors and the plows and things like that. That was not so great. Water runoff, think about the chemicals and fertilization that started to happen like, again, food machine that guy was talking about last week. When they introduced fertilizers, it changed the game for agriculture, right? Their plants could withstand longer. But on the flip side of that, if you start using more fertilizers and that gets into the ground and into the runoff, the water runoff, and eventually gets into your drinking water, that could be problematic, right? So that could be a bad thing. Also, we had soil erosion from double cropping. This is a vocab term that you'll see at some point. I think it's chapter 13. I actually just read it. So soil erosion happened because of double cropping. When these machines were able to produce or help us produce more crops faster, that meant that we could grow things quicker. We could have like 2 growing seasons per year instead of just 1. Instead of waiting a whole nother year to plant that crop and grow and then harvest, now we could plant, grow, harvest maybe 2 or 3 times a year, which means you're using that soil multiple times. You're not giving it time to rest in between and replenish itself. So that wears down the soil, and that can be bad for the soil. So that could be problematic too. Okay, so good things, but also bad things that can happen. And a lot of those bad things were environmental problems coming from all of that. Okay. All that makes sense? So we have 3, it's kind of the history a little bit there in agriculture. So the first agricultural revolution was known as what? Remember that N one? Neolithic revolution, right? Yeah, so that was when we settled down into one place. The second ag revolution was also what? Called what? The Industrial Revolution, and that happened what time period? 1800s, yeah, okay. And then this one, the third revolution is called what? Green Revolution, and that happened when? Mid-1900s. Okay, so quick history version there for you. A couple more slides, kind of switching gears just a little bit. Lots of vocab terms on this slide here. The chart on the left side is what you should be filling out in chapter 11 this week as you are reading your reading guide. You don't necessarily have to memorize everything on this chart, but it has different types of agriculture and where they're from. You kind of need to know where these things are. That would be beneficial for you. But over here on the right side, we have a couple of big vocab terms. Subsistence farming. Does anyone know what subsistence means? Natalie? Yeah, okay, yeah. You are feeding your own people, right? So it's very small scale. You feed yourself. Put that however you need to on your slide, but you're really just providing or making food for yourself, for your family, maybe your community or village around you, but it's fairly small scale, okay? So you don't really have the technology or the fertilizers or the pesticides or those things. You're really just doing it for yourself, so it's small scale, and a lot of times this is happening in LDCs. The opposite of that is commercial farming. Commercial farming would be big farms. It's sold for profit. It has all of the technology and the machines that are needed, okay? Think about the images we saw in the video last week of the 2 farms, the one in Kansas and the one in California. Very large scale, right? They had all of this land to be able to farm on. They had all of the tractors. They had all of the people. They had the fertilizers, the irrigation, all of that stuff. They have the money for it. That's commercial agriculture, right? They were selling their products to go on to a distribution center to then later go on to the grocery store or to the restaurant. That's commercial agriculture, okay? NIC countries are going to have a little bit of both, kind of in that transition period from subsistence farming into more commercial farming, like companies and things like that. So you kind of have a little bit of both. And then down at the bottom with commercial gardening, we talked about this last Wednesday on our skills day. Commercial gardening and truck farming, this is like your fruits and vegetables. And it's known as truck farming because typically you have to put it is transported on a truck and it can't go very far. Why could fruits and vegetables not go very far from where it's grown? Yeah, they go bad. Perishability, right? We're going to keep talking about that more next week. But yeah, they go bad. Now we have like inventions like refrigeration and things, so it can last a little bit longer. But even like the vegetables I bought on Saturday and the salad mix I got on Saturday still does have a shelf life, right? Like I can't eat it next week. It'll go bad before then, right? So to be able to transport those things, it goes on a truck. And what do trucks have to have access to? Yes, roads. And where are roads the best at? What types of countries? Yep, MDCs, right? So that transportation route, those transportation factors are usually better in MDC countries. So we see a lot of truck farming, fruits and vegetables coming out of more developed countries because they have the transportation means to do it. Okay? Okay. Next slide. Intensive and extensive. This used to be confusing to me. It's not so much anymore. Commercial, remember we said, is big. It's for money, right? Subsistence is small and for yourself, right? The way I keep track of intensive is that it requires a lot of work. It's really intense. Sometimes that means physical labor. It's really intense. That's how I remember intensive, okay? So with intensive farming, it requires a lot of work. If we're thinking commercial agriculture, big, large scale, it requires a lot of labor and machinery to get that product from the farm, okay? So things like truck farming, what we were just talking about, fruits and veggies. I think we talked about this last week about like a vineyard, right? Or an apple orchard or things like that. There's not really machines that can go through and pick off the things from the trees or from the vines, right? It requires people, physical human labor to go in and get the grapes off the vineyard or to go in and pick the oranges off the tree because there's just not a machine yet that can do it that will not ruin the tree itself, right? So it requires a physical person to go in and do that work. Also, dairy farming is another one. We know that there's a ton of machinery involved in dairy farming, but the cow itself cannot hook itself up, like hook the udders up to the machine, right? A person has to go in with the cow and put the machine onto the udders of the cow, right? So it requires human labor to do that. So that's what it would look like on a large scale commercial farm, okay? Intensive work, that subsistence, that smaller in that top right box, requires a ton of work. This is like rice farming, for sure. So it's very labor intensive on small plots of land. That link that's on that slide right there, rice farming. Was I telling you about this? How much work it takes to flood a rice field and then someone to go in and hand pick the rice plant because there's not a machine to do it. So it's very laborious. It's very hard on the person who is farming or growing rice. That's intensive subsistence, okay? And then on the opposite end, you have extensive, which requires less work or inputs, okay? It requires less hard work, I guess, from people. So on a commercial scale, that would be like livestock ranching and grain farming. Grain farming has a lot of machinery that can do the work for the people. And livestock ranching doesn't require a whole lot of like physical human labor to just let cows out on a ranch, right? So that would be commercial, but subsistence, it is usually small scale. And again, you're not making a whole lot of money off of this, but it's things like pastoral nomadism and shifting cultivation, which we'll talk about here in a second. But it doesn't require a whole lot of physical or human like worker input into that type of farming, okay? Intensive and extensive was hard for me to grasp my first couple of years of teaching this. There's a good section in chapter 11, I believe, when you'll read this week, and then again when you start reading chapter 13, that talks about this difference between intensive and extensive. Just think intensive is intense labor. It's intense work. That's kind of how I have trained myself to think about this. Okay? All right. Here, maps. Let's look at these maps. We looked at climate map last week, but now this is how it relates specifically to what is grown where in the world. So over here in our key, we have subsistence agriculture. That was what again? Subsistence is self. Yes, it's self and it's small. What is commercial down at the bottom? Big and for money, right? For profit. Okay. So let's look at where these things are grown. Up at the top is the gray box. It says little to no agriculture. Where are these gray places on our map? What? North. Yeah. Why is it so far north? What's wrong with that for agriculture? It's too cold. Yeah. It's not good growing conditions. It's too cold way up here at the, in the north. Where else is it gray? Can you not grow things?
Some parts in Africa.
Yeah, the desert. Yeah, some parts in Africa and the desert. Yeah, so all that right there, desert, can't grow there. There's also a big desert down here in Australia. Can't grow anything there. What about up there north of India? What is this gray right here? What physical feature is that? Yep, mountains. Can't grow anything in really high latitudes or high elevation, sorry. And there's also more mountains down here in Chile, right? So high elevation, too cold, too hot, can't grow anything, right? And we see that on our map. So let's talk about subsistence agriculture. These kind of lighter pale colors that we see. Shifting cultivation is that light green color. Where do we see that light green shifting cultivation at the most? Not Asia, the light green. It's kind of that greenish yellow color. Okay, lots in Africa and South America, right? Right along the equator, right? What is that big area right there in South America called? Yeah, what is it? Amazon. Yeah, that's the Amazon. So lots of trees. This is rainforest, right? Same thing in Africa. That's rainforest because it lies right along the equator, right? And shifting cultivation, has anyone read yet? Anyone know what shifting cultivation is? No? It's where you have to move. It's literally what it sounds like. You shift. You shift between plots of land. So you farm in one place for a little while, for maybe a couple of seasons, and then you move on to the next plot of land, and then you grow there for a few seasons, and then you move on to the next place. So this is very common around the equator in forest type of areas. How do they clear forests? How do they grow things in forests? Yeah, they cut them down. What'd you say? Deforestation. They cut them down. It's called slash and burn. Have you heard of slash and burn? Yeah? What'd you say? Crash and burn? Slash and burn. So they cut down the trees, they burn the trees, and then when you burn, when you have a fire, when you burn stuff, it adds nutrients to the soil. So it's better to plant things there. And so that's what is happening in the Amazon, like you said, with deforestation. That's exactly what's happening. When we watched the chocolate episode, right, last week of Rotten? We started it, right? But did we get to the part where it was talking about slash and burn? I think that was with my other class. So thanks. This is happening in Africa where they're growing all of this chocolate. In that one episode, we didn't get to that part yet, but they showed where there was this protected national forest, it was rainforest and it was protected by the government, but people have gone in there, kind of further back, and they've cut down trees, they've burned the trees, and then they've planted their cocoa trees to grow their cocoa to sell, because it's better farming land in there. So it's literally slash and burn in the middle of these protected forests. They're doing it illegally, but that's how they're able to grow their crops and then feed their family, because they were talking about how little they're paid, right? So that's happening with cocoa farms in Africa. It happens a lot around the equator in these tropical environments. That's how they farm, with shifting cultivation. Okay, so these other couple of light colors or pale colors we have over here, the pink and the purple. The pink one says intensive subsistence. It's wet rice dominant. Where's that light pink color at? Yeah, East Asia. All of that is rice over there, right? We just talked about it takes a lot of people, or it takes a lot of human labor. It's intense work, and a lot of the time rice comes from East Asia. The purple color says wet rice not dominant, but it's still intensive subsistence. So it still takes a lot of people or a lot of human labor to work it, but it's just not rice. It's things like potatoes or cassava or things like that. And again, around those areas, it's in Asia, right? Central Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia is where all of that purple is, right? So intensive work. And then the last color is that green color, pastoral nomadism. Lots in Africa, Middle East, Asia. That's all pastoral nomadism. Do you know what that is? Have we talked about that yet? What is nomad? Someone who wanders, right? So then what would pastoral be with it? For the animals, yeah. So you have a herd of some sort of animal, and you're moving around your animal. Why would you have to move it? To find things for it to eat, because if you stay in one place, you're going to overgraze, right? They won't have enough food to eat, so you're constantly moving. And a lot of this is happening in these dry, arid places, right? In the desert and in Middle East and in Central Asia. They're moving their herds around, but they don't eat their animals. That's super important. They don't eat their animals because that's their living, right? They have to use their milk, they have to use their hide and their wool and things like that, their skin kind of, but they don't eat the meat, because then they can't get that back, right? So they're always moving. So these kind of pale colors we see are a lot in our LDCs and in our NIC countries of the world, right? So then further down, when we have our commercial agriculture, these are kind of like the brighter colors. We see mixed crop and livestock, dairy, grain, livestock, Mediterranean, commercial gardening. We saw a lot of pictures of these last week in our skills lesson, right? Look at the dairy orange color. Where do you see that light orange color the most? In the U.S. and in Europe, right? But where at? North, right? Yeah. So it's a lot further north, because typically dairy cows need it to be cooler. There's not a lot of dairy farms down here in the south where it's too hot. They don't produce enough milk, so they keep them in cooler regions. That's why most of our dairy farms are farther north. And also across the ocean, same thing in Europe. It's in the further northern regions where it's cooler, okay? Livestock ranching is in our western part and also in the southern part of South America. We'll talk about that in a second, but look at Mediterranean. Remember talking about Mediterranean agriculture last week? Things like grapes and figs and olives. We see that brown color a lot around the Mediterranean Sea right there, right? We see all of that brown area there. And we also have it over here in the U.S. because we have vineyards in California that we've talked about. But also in the South, Australia and South America, or South Africa and South America also have good wineries because they grow grapes. And this is direct correlation. I'm going to livestock ranching. Notice how our livestock ranching is happening up here in our western parts. If you look at the southern region across the equator, all of that livestock ranching is happening in South America about at the same latitude, just in the southern hemisphere, okay? Same thing over here in Australia And in Central Asia, it's the same distance from the equator. Just one's in the northern hemisphere, one's in the southern hemisphere. Okay, so it's directly related. Those climate, you put the last slide on the screen so that you can see that it is a mirror reflection across the equator. So if we look at this climate map, it's a direct correlation. What is our climate like at the equator? Hot. Yeah, it's real hot. What about the farther away we go? Cold. It's cold in the north, it's cold in the south, right? But then look at how it's a mirror image. We were literally just talking about Mediterranean agriculture, right? Think about grapes, think about vineyards, think about wine. Wine comes a lot from the Mediterranean here and in California, right? And then if you flip that on its side across the equator, we see those same climate regions in Australia, South Africa, and South America, right? Where the vineyards are in the southern hemisphere. So we see this similarity from northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere. The same types of agriculture are happening across the equator, okay? Same thing with back climate regions have a direct impact on what can be grown where. Does that make sense? You see that? Okay, so you kind of had a leg up because of our skills lesson last week. Okay, so now we get to practice our writing. It's just one part of an FRQ is all we're focusing on here, okay? You have a compare task verb. Compare is something that we have not done a whole lot of practice on, but you need to know that compare requires a lot of explanation. So you're explaining two different things from our original ice cream FRQ. Remember, we chose ice cream and what was it, like brownies or cookies or something, and we compared both things. This time around, you're comparing farming in developing and developed countries. So your LDC countries and your MDC countries. That means you have to talk about the similarities and or the differences. So you can only talk about the similarities, you can only talk about the differences, you can talk about both, but you have to address what's happening in LDC countries and MDC countries in your response. Okay, so this means it should be a decent paragraph worth of information. I would think at least like 6 sentences, because that would be like 3 for LDCs, 3 for MDCs. Like that should probably try to be your goal. That way you can provide enough explanation for both things, for LDCs and for MDCs. Okay, so as you're going to type this in the same entry as your Padlet. Like your Padlet entry, you're going to upload your notes that we just took, and then you can just type in the same box. Okay, so it's 2 parts to 1 entry. Make sense? All right, cool. That's what we're doing.